Unequal resources for political competition undermine the promise of equal citizenship. And it's worth noting in passing that on some assumptions, notably those of Friedrich von Hayek and early opponents of democracy in this country, like Lord Salisbury, have held that the equality which political democracy brings to the political realm actually undermines the capitalist market economy because of the pressures for resource redistribution which result. Now, this is an interesting, however, this creates a dilemma, a very serious dilemma for capitalist societies. Because in the modern world, at least, regimes have to look democratic in order to be legitimate. Maybe China is the one big exception, and I'm not sure how long China will remain as an exception, but that's by the way. So there's a dilemma. How can we reconcile, the outward appearance of democracy with the inward reality of untamed capitalism? Very tough dilemma. In the contemporary United Kingdom, the answer, I think, is what the Cambridge historian Stephen Collini has nicely described as market populism. Citizens become customers. Voting becomes shopping. Politicians become salesmen of illusion, promising ever greater individual benefits that no one can deliver. Disembodied, charismatic leaders float above a population of atomistic individuals and derive their legitimacy from their claim to have a direct line to the popular will. Thatcher and Blair were obviously the prime examples, and the fates of John Major and Gordon Brown, both honourable and decent men, shows what happens to leaders who can't hack it in this rather unpleasant new world. Cameron's none too subtle recent appeal to Islamophobia makes it pretty clear that he's learnt that lesson and he doesn't want to be a second Major or a second Brown. So, I hope I've made your flesh creep, actually. The total picture is bleak. A partially crippled public domain, one of the least egalitarian societies in Europe, a debased version of democracy that makes a mockery of the dream of democrats from the days of ancient Athens to modern Cairo, the virtual disappearance of the language of the public good. Now, I don't think gloom, however, is unrelieved. I think in contemporary Britain you can detect growth points of a better society, and I shall turn to them in a moment. But I want to utter a word of warning first. What I've called turbo-capitalism or untamed capitalism has been legitimized by a passionately held moral vision, or you might say immoral vision, but the people who hold it think it's a moral vision. According to this, the unhindered, rationally calculated pursuit of individual self-interest in free competitive markets is not just economically efficient, but also morally right. Only if individuals are free to pursue their rationally chosen interests as they wish will they be moral beings. Collectivist interference would turn them, in Mrs. Thatcher's frightening phrase, into moral cripples. Now, this vision was enormously powerful and enormously seductive. It bathed flagrant disparities of reward in the odor of sanctity. It told the ultra-rich that they were morally entitled to their riches, and the aspirant middle and working classes that if they obeyed its precepts, they too would be rich, or at least richer. Above all, it ran with the grain of a culture increasingly in awe of the holy trinity of choice, freedom, and the individual in virtually every sphere of life, from the most intimate to the most public. Now, it's time, I think, to dispel the cloud of unthinking reverence that has surrounded that holy trinity. Not all choices are morally equal. Freedom as a source of human flourishing is one thing. Freedom to ignore the common good is quite another. The individual, yes, but not as a bloodless abstraction detached from society and history. We can't go back, and I don't want to go back, to the highly structured, hierarchical, and in many ways oppressive society that I grew up in. But I do think we should challenge the debased moral vision that permeates the culture of the 21st century. The question is how. Now, this is not a manifesto. I have no magic bullets to distribute, but I offer two thoughts. First, I think that there are resources in our informal institutions and social movements on which we can build. London Citizens is one striking example. The nationwide protests against library closures are another. Compass itself, you'll be glad to hear, is a third. The burgeoning environmental movement is a fourth. These show, I think, that although the language of the common good barely figures in political discourse any longer, the notion itself is still alive. And second point I want to make is, I think the same is true of our three main political traditions. Edmund Burke, often called the father of conservatism, thought society was what he called a partnership between the living, the dead, and the unborn, implying an ethic of stewardship rather closer, I think, to the Green Party of today than to any of the big parties, and that challenges what I'm calling turbo-capitalism at its heart. John Stuart Mill, the prophet of social liberalism, is rightly seen as the champion of individual freedom. But the freedom that he prized was not freedom to accumulate or exploit. It was freedom to develop and grow through arduous practice in civil associations and local bodies, and in doing so, to contribute what he called the worth of society. And the ethical socialists, over 100 years ago, espoused a vision of fellowship or fraternity rooted in the lived experience of the labor movement, and quite different from the statism and economism of the new labor regime. In different ways, I think all of these point the way to what I would call a democratic, republican politics of civic engagement, mutual learning, and public reasoning. In a marvelous book that has influenced me hugely, although I've only recently read it, Not for Profit, a philippic against instrumentalism in higher education by the American philosopher Martha Nussbaum, she spotlights what I see as the moral foundations of such a politics. Democracy for her is not just head counting. It must be informed by critical thinking, daring daring imagination and empathetic understanding. It depends, she says, on rich human relationships, on the ability to see other people as human beings and not simply as objects. So here is another trinity, human rather than holy. Imagination, empathy, and critical thinking. The task for us is to make that trinity sing.